Hey everyone, today's an interesting day to reflect on our justice system. There are a couple cases that are going to get reported on separately. I want to connect the dots between clemency being granted to Julius Jones in Oklahoma, the exoneration of Muhammad Aziz and Khalil Islam for the assassination of Malcolm X, and then the trial of both Kyle Rittenhouse in Wisconsin and the corporate prosecution of Steven Donziger. And a couple themes just to sort of identify before we dive in. People often think of justice as the exclusive province of the legal system. We'll see through these examples how the legal system very often abandons justice, and at least in some cases how the political branches can intervene. So first, Julius Jones is a perfect example of that pattern. The death penalty is an abomination. It's a human rights abuse categorically. It is barbaric. We often execute people who are ultimately innocent, largely because our legal system is not terribly concerned with ascertaining guilt versus innocence. We have lots of theoretical protections for defendants. When you think about everything from racial bias in jury selection to sentencing, the vastly disproportionate resources available between prosecutors and overwhelmed public defenders, there's a lot of structural biases in the legal system that contribute to systematic injustice. Julius Jones's case was one of them. Overwhelming evidence of his innocence. And just to be clear, he's not being set free and his innocence has not been acknowledged. But he at least, at the 11th hour, was saved from an execution that would have been a moral stain on us all, as every example of the death penalty is, ultimately. I want to particularly shout out not just the 6 million people who signed a change.org petition calling for clemency, but specifically the students across Oklahoma who walked out yesterday and seeing grassroots voices compel justice, in this case from the governor, a political actor, where the legal system failed to live up to its own principles, our principles, in writing. It's an inspiring example of the impact that activism can have and the opportunity through politics to hold an unaccountable legal system, an otherwise unaccountable legal system accountable. So let's move on from that. The exoneration of Khalil Islam and Muhammad Aziz for the murder of Malcolm X. This is a big deal for a lot of reasons, and I'm glad that they're being exonerated. The first thing I want to point out is that they spent decades in prison under false pretenses. The second question I want to ask here is, for what exactly? If they were scapegoats, what were they scapegoats for? We know that the FBI at the time of his assassination was engaged in a 50-year pattern of infiltrating all kinds of First Amendment protected groups across the United States, organizations seeking civil rights, bringing peace to the war in Vietnam, organizations seeking equal rights for women, and Black Power organizations, including the ones that he had come out of. And given the FBI's likely role, I would like to see the Bureau finally investigated. In 1976 was the last time Congress meaningfully investigated our nation's intelligence agencies. And they found their hands in the constitutional cookie jar. It's why we have intelligence committees in the House and the Senate today. Both of them, however, have been structurally co-opted and have effectively fallen asleep at the switch. We need a new church committee and an equivalent like the Pike Committee in the House. It's one reason I'm running for Congress, because the person who represents my city, Nancy Pelosi, has been an architect of mass surveillance and an insulator of this serial corruption that I would like to very much expose. The exoneration of Muhammad Aziz and Khalil Islam points to a broader pattern, and I'd like to get to the bottom of that ultimately. Let's look at the trial of Kyle Rittenhouse. So many things to say here. I think the nation is finally observing the bias that pervades our justice system. How different would this trial be if Kyle Rittenhouse had dark skin? And I want to point out I don't want to dive into all the different ways in which Judge Schroeder has revealed a bias in favor of the defendant, but the point I want to point out here is that he is a former prosecutor himself, as are a preponderance of judges in state systems across the country. It's one locus of the racial and anti-defendant bias that we have seen infect the legal system, is the co-optation of the judiciary, its infection, if you will, by veterans of the executive branch who are then called on to sit in judgment of their former colleagues. And you see, I mean, in this case, it's somewhat twisted because the prosecutor is in a rare instance actually seeking a justice, as opposed to, more like predatory application of social wills. And in the rare case where you would want to see a judge demonstrate some deference to a prosecutor, it's conspicuously not there. And the bias is unfortunate. It is predictable. It is growing apparent to more and more people. I am grateful for that, but I want to contrast what we are seeing there with the more grateful opportunities for celebration that we might have from Oklahoma to New Jersey. Then the last thing I want to say with respect to the legal system is we're looking at the bias that the prosecution of Kyle Rittenhouse reveals. There's another prosecution that reveals even greater, I don't want to say greater, at least more expansive problems globally. And that is the corporate prosecution of human rights lawyer Steven Donziger. He represented Ecuadorian indigenous tribes in a successful series of lawsuits against Chevron. And Judge Lewis Kaplan in New York took the extraordinary step, after prosecutors declined to prosecute him for any number of reasons, he appointed Chevron's law firm to prosecute this human rights lawyer who is now in prison at the behest of a corporation covering its behind at the cost of indigenous communities and climate justice. That's through our legal system. That is the kind of injustice we see mediated through the formal processes. It's all the more reasons that we need political branches, political actors like progressive prosecutors, like members of Congress to pass more liberatory policies, to dismantle mass incarceration. It's all the more reason that we need political interventions. I just want to come back to the gratitude, particularly to all the students who've taken action to hold the establishment's feet to the fire and force clemency for Julius Jones. It's an example that we celebrate today and we can build on going forward.